Welcome back to the Wealth Fact. Today, we're talking about private equity. Look, I know what you're thinking. I'm just trying to pay my rent and maybe buy some more Nvidia stock before it crashes. Why would I care about a bunch of guys in Patagonia vest in a random boardroom? Here's why. Because private equity is basically an invisible force in all of our lives. They probably own the vet where you take your dog, your car wash that you use on the weekend, and quite possibly the apartment building you live in. Some people call private equity the barbarians, vultures who sweep in, strip companies of their assets, and leave them for dead. Others say they're the only ones that will have the guts and the cash to save a dying brand and turn them back into their $10 billion brand they once were. In today's episode, we're looking at how private equity started back in 1901 with JP Morgan as their origin story to the 2026 Steward Health Care collapse. We're talking about how they make their billions of dollars and why there's still a red tape around it and it keeps people out, and whether private equity is actually something good for the economy. So let's get into the origin story of private equity. If you want to understand private equity, you have to stop thinking about the stock market tickers. Private equity is more on the outskirts of the street. At its simplest form, private equity is an investment class where professional managers that are called the general partners pool their massive amounts of money from traditional investors, which is the limited partner. Think of them as they are basically the funds and endowments of schools or other companies to buy stakes in companies that aren't listed on the public exchanges. The goal of all this is to add value. They buy a company, overhaul its operations, cut it down, maybe load it with some strategic debt, and aim to sell it between 5 to 7 years later for a massive gain. It's essentially house flipping for multi-billion-dollar companies. While the term private equity feels a product of the 1980s, the concept actually goes back to 1901. Banking giant JP Morgan pulled off what was considered the first true mega deal when he purchased Carnegie Steel for $480 million, roughly $16 billion today, and merged it with several other firms to create US Steel. It was the first billion-dollar company in history. Morgan didn't just randomly buy businesses, he restructured them into an entire industry. The industry we recognize today kicked off right after World War II. Two firms that changed everything in 1946. ARDC, which is American Research and Development Corporation, founded by George Dwight, the father of venture capital. This firm provided the private capital that could fund the new economy by investing in technology. And J.H. Whitney and Company, they pioneered the modern structure of using private wealth to professionalize small businesses. Before this, if you weren't a wealthy family like the Rockefellers, you didn't do private equity. These firms turned rich guy investing into a structured asset class. So basically, if the 40s were basically the birthplace of it, the 80s were the adrenaline shot years of everything. This was the era of the leverage buyout, or LBO. Firms like KKR realized that they didn't need to use their own cash to buy a company. They could use the target company's own assets as collateral to borrow the money for the purchase. It was a high risk, high reward, and very controversial move. The 1989 takeover of RJR Nabisco for $25 billion became the defining moment of this. Documented in the famous book Barbarians at the Gate, it signaled to the world that no company, no matter how big, was safe from private equity with enough credit line. Today, private equity has evolved into a niche corner of Wall Street, into a $13 trillion global behemoth. Firms like Blackstone and Apollo are no longer just random raiders. They are massive asset managers owning everything from the local Hilton hotel to the software that runs your local doctor's office. The current buzzword going around in private equity right now is dry powder. The record amount of committed cash currently hovering over $2.5 trillion that PE firms have raised that hasn't been spent yet. They're sitting on a massive pile of cash, waiting for the next market dip to start the cycle all over again. In the early days, the goal was relatively simple. Find a fat and happy company, buy it with debt, and lean it out. PE firms were masters at leverage buyouts. They would put down 10 to 20% of the cash and borrow the rest. If the company's value went up even just a bit, the return on that small sliver of equity was massive. They also had another strategy, the cost cutting strategy. The goal was often efficiency. They looked for conglomerates and underperforming divisions. They'd buy up the whole thing, sell it for parts, called asset stripping, slash corporate overhead, and use the saved cash flow to pay off the massive amount of debt that they used to buy the company. There was also the reputation strategy. This is where the barbarian slang came from. The goal was often to see as extractive. Fixing the balance sheet was more important than actually fixing the product, leaving the company behind so the private equity firm can extract as much value as they could. Today, you can't really rely on cheap debt and a pair of scissors to cut everything down. Interest rates are higher than they were in 2010s, and even undervalued companies already have more than 10 PE firms bidding on it. The goal has basically shifted from an operational value creation. Today's top firms like Blackstone or Bravo aren't just looking to cut costs, they're looking for revenue to grow. They install operating partners, former CEOs, and industry experts as they run the business better. They also tend to do the buy and build strategy. Instead of buying one big company, a PE firm will buy one solid platform company, then acquire 10 smaller competitive to bolt onto it. This creates a massive market leader that commands a higher sale price. PE firms also started specializing. They moved away from being a generalist to specialized firms such as software as a service, healthcare logistics, and green infrastructure. The goal is to be so smart in one niche that they can spot a trend before the market actually does and buy all the companies in it. PE firms are also looking into permanent capital. Instead of a strict 5 to 7 year flip window, some firms are holding companies for 10 to 15 years now. The goal is to basically buy a compounding machine rather than a quick exit. So why is there a shift? Basically competition. There's so much dry powder out there that is chasing very few companies. So winning isn't about price anymore. It's about who will have the better strategy. And also transparency. With more data available, you can't just hide a bad company behind a fancy balance sheet. It's actually more incentivized to do a better business when you sell it instead of wrecking it in the process. While the barbarians label stuck for decades, modern private equity often acts more like a high-stakes emergency room for dying businesses. When a private equity firm revives a company, they aren't shifting numbers on a spreadsheet anymore. They are often rebuilding the whole thing from the bottom up. And here's 3 legendary stories about this process. The first is Hilton Hotels. Back in 2007, Blackstone pulled off the largest leverage buyout in history at the time, purchasing Hilton for $26 billion. And if you panic when you heard that day, there's a reason. The timing couldn't have been worse. Weeks after the deal closed, the 2008 financial crisis hit. Travel plummeted, and Blackstone's investment was immediately underwater. At one point, they had to write down nearly 70% of their equity. Instead of folding, Blackstone doubled down. They brought in a new CEO who basically criticized the messy and fragmented management structure. They expanded Hilton's global footprint, especially in China, and launching new brands such as Home2 Suites. They aggressively restructured the massive amount of debt that they used to buy the company. By the time Blackstone fully exited in 2018, they had turned nearly a disaster into one of the most profitable PE deals ever made, walking away with nearly $14 billion in profit. The second story is about Hostess brands. In 2012, the unthinkable happened. The Twinkie died. The Hostess brand filed for Chapter 7 liquidity, fired nearly 18,000 workers, and shut down every factory. The brand was effectively dead. Then came Apollo Global Management and Metropolitan and Company, basically to step into the wreckage, buying the snack cake brand for a merely $410 million. They didn't just restart the old ovens, they basically re-innovated the whole supply chain. They invested heavily in auto bakery technology and moved from a direct-to-store sale delivery method, which was bleeding cash, to a warehouse model. They even tweaked the recipe to extend the shelf life, making the product more attractable to retailers, but at a crazy consequences that Twinkies last forever. Within 4 years, they took the company public again. In late 2023, JM Smuckers bought Hostess for $5.6 billion. over a $5 billion in profit. Apollo turned a bankrupt, expired brand into a multi-billion-dollar exit and saving the Twinkie. Our final story is about Dollar General. In 2007, Dollar General was a struggling discount retailer with messy stores and an identity crisis. KKR stepped in with a $7.3 billion buyout. KKR didn't just cut costs, they focused on the customer of one. They realized the core customer was often living paycheck to paycheck, so they optimized the stores for high frequency, small ticket essential items such as milk, eggs, and detergent. They cleaned up the junk store image, improved lighting, and standardized the layout of thousands of locations. They used their massive scales to negotiate better prices, pass the savings on to the customer, while still keeping healthy margins. When KKR took Dollar General public again in 2009, the stock soared. Today, Dollar General is a retail titan with more locations in the US than any other retailer, proving that PE can scale a mom and pop shop to feel like a Fortune 500 powerhouse. So what do these stories have in common? That PE firms didn't just strip away the assets. They provided potential capital, the ability to ignore quarterly earnings and fix the business for the long haul. They had top-tier talent, bringing operating CEOs that knew the industry, and efficiency upgrades, using technology to fix broken distribution and supply chain models. However, not every PE story ends with the company being saved. Sometimes the weight of the debt and the efficiency measures are what kills the company. So here are 3 other stories that PE firms ruined brands. The first, and one of the most iconic, is Toys R Us. In 2005, Brain Capital, KKR, and Fernando Realty Trust took the world's most famous toy store private in a $6.6 billion leverage buyout. The strategy was the classic LBO. Use the cash, borrow mountains of debt, and use the store's massive holiday profits to pay it off. However, the downfall came in 3 stages. The first being the debt trap. The company saddled with roughly $400 million in annual interest payments. This meant even if they had a good year, they couldn't reinvest into their stores, into their website, or their customer experience. Then came the Amazon factor. While Toys R Us was busy paying interest, Amazon and Walmart were busy launching their own tech and with lower prices. The result? Choked by debt and unable to modernize. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2007, thousands of stores closed, and the brand that defined childhood for generations was effectively wiped off the map until more recently with a revival, but we'll see how that comes around. Friendly's was a quintessential East Coast family restaurant. In 2007, Sun Capital Partners bought the chain for $337 million. Sun Capital specialized in distressed assets. They wanted to streamline operations and turn the aging brand around. They were too aggressive in efficiency. PE firms often look at the real estate as a potential separate asset. In many cases, firms sell the land that the restaurant sits on and then lease it back to them, known as the sale back lease. This provides quick cash and adds a permanent heavy rent expense to the balance sheet. The 2008 recession also hit, and the dining experience was hit hard. Families stopped going out for $10 Sundays, which is equivalent to $15 today. And the result was that Friendly's filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy twice, once in 2011 and again in 2020. The chain winded down from over 500 locations to less than 130 today. And the final story is also another iconic one, Payless. At its peak, Payless had over 4,000 stores. It was basically the affordable place for footwear. In 2012, it was taken over in a buyout involving Golden Gate Capital and Blum Capital. The goal was to dominate the value footwear market by squeezing every penny out of the supply chain. And as you can tell, the downfall was pretty intense. There was inventory issues. The PE owners pushed for a lean inventory. But in fashion, if you don't have the right size or style, the customer just leaves. And they were blind to e-commerce. Like Toys R Us, the debt load made it impossible to pivot into a digital world. The result was that Payless filed for bankruptcy twice in 3 years. By 2019, they closed all 2,100 of their remaining US stores. It remains one of the largest retail liquidations in history. So why did it all go wrong? For a few reasons, but here's three. They over leverage. They put too much debt onto the company. If the economy drifts even slightly, the company can't make its mortgage payments. The second being that they focused on the short term. Trying to fix a brand in 3 years when the industry is shifting, they couldn't do it. It takes 10 years to rebuild that brand, and they weren't patient. The third being real estate stripping, selling off the company's bones, which is the land and buildings they owned, for a quick payout, leaving the company with high rent and no assets to borrow against, is just failure. Now let's move on to the employees of the company. If you want to know why people sell their soul and work 100-hour weeks at firms like Blackstone or Apollo, you have to look at the math. In private equity, you aren't just making a salary, you are playing for the carry. While every firm is different, the golden standard for a decade has been the 220 fee split. It's designed to keep the lights on while providing massive incentive to actually perform. 2% management fee. The PE firm charges its investors, which are limited partners, roughly 2% of the total money committed every year. If the firm manages $10 billion fund, they're getting $200 million a year just for existing and holding the money. This covers fancy offices, the travel, and the six-figure salary for junior associates. The 20% is carried interest, or the carry. This is basically like their holy grail. Once a PE firm returns the initial investment plus a hurdle rate, usually around 8% profit to the investors, the firm gets to keep 20% of all remaining profits. So why does this matter? This is treated as the capital gain rather than ordinary income in a majority of the districts, which is a massive tax advantage for partners. It's the difference between the rich and the wealthy. And here's a couple of timelines to understand what these PE firms are doing. The 10-year marriage timeline is a private equity fund isn't like a bank account where you can withdraw money whenever you want. When a pension fund invests in a PE firm, they are locking in their money probably for a decade. The typical fund life cycle is in the first year to 3 years is the investment period. The firm is calling capital. They are finding companies, buying them, and starting the heavy lifting. From years 4 to 7 is the creation value phase. This is where the work happens. They swap out management, fix supply chain issues, and expand into new markets. By years 7 and 10 is basically their exit phase. The firm starts selling the companies, basically the harvest. They either sell to another company as a strategic sale or another PE firm, which is a secondary buyout, or they take the company public in an IPO. However, the 5 to 7 year flip is a little different. While the last fund lasts 10 years, the goal of an individual company is usually 5 to 7 year hold period. So why 5 to 7? It's long enough for the results of major restructuring, but short enough for the internal rate of return to be high. In the world of private equity, time is basically the enemy. $100 million profit after 3 years is so much better for your scorecard than $100 million profit after 10 years. Lastly is basically the shift in the new market. Some massive firms are moving away from the 10-year clock and heading into long hold funds that can last 15 to 20 years. They realize that some of their trophy assets, like major infrastructure or top-tier real estate, is often better just to keep for the cash flow rather than just forcing a sale just because the calendar says so. So who gets to actually participate in private equity? Private equity is often called the private club for a reason. Unlike the stock market where anyone with a smartphone can buy a $5 fractional share of Apple, the PE door is guarded and strictly regulated with massive minimums for buy-ins. So here are a few people that can basically hold on to this and invest. The first being institutional heavyweights. The vast majority of the trillions of dollars in private equity doesn't come from individuals at all. It comes from massive pools of patient capital that needs to grow over decades. One of the big ones being pension funds. These are the biggest players. When a teacher in California or a firefighter in New York retires, Their pension is often paid out in profits made by PE firms. These PE funds love it because it offers a higher rate of return than bonds. There's also university endowments. Elite schools like Harvard, Yale, and Stanford are famous for their endowment model. They keep a huge chunk of their multi-billion-dollar portfolios in private equity to fund scholarships and research for the next century. There are also sovereign wealth funds. These state-owned investment funds, like those in Norway, Saudi Arabia, and Abu Dhabi, that invest their nation's wealth into global private equity markets. There are also insurance companies. They take their premiums you pay for your car or home and invest them into PE to ensure that they have enough cash to pay out their claims for the next 30 years. There are also high net worth individuals. For individuals that can invest directly into PE funds, the SEC in the US typically requires them to meet one of two elite badges. An accredited investor historically is one that has a net worth of $1 million, excluding your home, or an annual income of $200,000. These investors can access smaller 3C1 funds. Qualified purchasers is basically the VIP section of the VIP section. To get into the biggest, most prestigious funds, you generally need to own $5 million in total assets. These individuals are considered sophisticated enough to handle the fact that they could lock away or lose their money for decades. So what about the rest of us? Basically, it's getting a little easier. The velvet rope, it's basically starting to lower for everyone. The 401k shift, as early as 2026, the Department of Labor rules that has made it easier for employers to include alternative assets like PE inside 401k plans. So you might see private equity investing in your 401k plan without even knowing it. Specialized interval funds allow regular investors to buy in with low minimums, usually as low as $1,000, though they only allow you to pull out your money at specific times or intervals. There are also now publicly traded PE firms. Even if you don't invest in their fund, you can buy the stock in the firm themselves. Anyone who buys shares in Blackstone or KKR on the stock exchange are essentially buying private equity. So why do these barriers even still exist in the modern age? The first being liquidity. You can't sell your PE stock on a Thursday because you need car repairs. It's completely locked away. And the lack of disclosure. Private companies don't have to file the same public reports as companies like Apple or Tesla. It's basically a black box. So you might not have a PE firm in your contacts list or on Google Maps, but you're likely interacted with one of them before, and they probably made your morning coffee. In 2026, private equity isn't just some Wall Street phenomenon. It's basically the invisible doctor or the invisible landlord in the middle class of America. Here are a couple ways of how you interact with them. If you've ever tried to buy a starter home in basically the Sun Belt lately, places like Atlanta, Phoenix, or Charlotte, you're basically stepping foot into a PE firm's area. Firms have spent years buying thousands of single-family homes, turning the American dream of ownership into a subscription service, basically rent. As early as 2026, it has reached a boiling point where institutional investors are owning massive shares of rental listings in specific suburban zip codes. This is leading to federal bans on institutional purchases of single-family homes. While the data shows that institutional owners hold less than 3% of the total U.S. housing market, their concentration in starter homes basically increased the brackets, fundamentally changing for young families that cannot afford these houses anymore. When you take your dog to the vet, visit the dentist, or go to the urgent care clinic, look at the logo at the door. It might be a local name, but in the back offices, it's run by a PE platform. PE firms love fragmented industries. They buy up 50 local dental practices, centralize billing, use their scale to negotiate better prices on supplies, and implement high-efficiency software. With the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in late 2025, the industry is pivoting. PE-backed healthcare is moving towards value-based care, where they get paid for patients' outcomes rather than just the number of tests they run. It is a tech-heavy, data-driven version of medicine that prioritizes outpatient efficiency over traditional hospital stays. And then there's the crisis of car washes. because you've been suddenly seeing so many high-tech car washes popping up in your town. It's all because of private equity. Private equity firms are buying businesses and creating them that are sticky, basically predictable customers and expenses. And car wash memberships are just that. They take the normal car wash, adding a $20 subscription model, and suddenly it's a high margin financial asset that can be packaged and sold to a pension fund. Now let's get into the Steward Health Care collapse. If you want to see the darkest manifestation of the financial engineering era, let's see what happened to Steward Health Care. It's basically ground zero for what people fear in private equity in medicine. In 2010, Cerberus Capital Management bought a struggling nonprofit hospital system in Massachusetts and turned it into Steward. To get their money back quickly, Cerberus executed a sale leaseback. They sold the land and buildings, the actual hospitals, to the real estate investment trust called Medical Properties Trust for $1.25 billion. This gave Cerberus a massive cash inflow, allowing them to pay themselves $790 million in dividends, while they were still technically owners of the company. The hospital no longer owned its own buildings. They had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in rent to these REITs just to keep their lights on and their operating rooms. The problem with stripping away these assets is that it leaves a business with zero margin for error. By 2024, the rent payment basically became an anchor. While the PE firm had already made their profits via dividends, the hospital was struggling. There were reports of doctors having to MacGyver, basically do makeshift equipment because vendors weren't being paid and they weren't getting the medical supplies that they needed for heart valves or even trash bags because they maxed out the credit lines from the company. In May 2024, Steward Health Care filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was the largest hospital failures in U.S. history, leaving 31 hospitals across 8 states in limbo. The collapse of the hospitals triggered a massive regulatory backlash that reshaped the industry. New legislation had been introduced to prevent PE firms from stripping assets from healthcare entities within a certain time frame of a buyout. Every PE deal in healthcare now faces a public interest review. It showed when you treat a hospital like a house flip, the community is the one that pays the price for the mishandling. This case serves as a warning to the investors that if you extract too much value too quickly, you don't just kill the company. You invite the government to basically dismantle your whole business model. And if you thought PE firms only cared about boring business models like car washes, healthcare, dental clinics, well, 2026 is a different shift in the PE firms. They are now aggressively buying up YouTube channels and move past the era of influencers into digital infrastructure. In the eyes of Blackstone or Moonbug, a massive YouTube channel isn't just a guy with a camera anymore. It's a high margin media asset with global distribution networks that never sleep. It creates sticky revenue. Thanks to YouTube's joint memberships, Patreon integrations, and AdSense, channels now have recurring revenue models that PE firms want. They aren't just buying the videos anymore, they're buying the intellectual property. If a channel has a mascot or recognizable brand, like Coco Melon, the PE firm can just leverage that into toys, Netflix specials, or licensing deals. Just like the hospital section, PE firms are buying 10 mid-tier educational or gaming channels, centralizing the editing, thumbnails, and creation of it, using their scale to land massive brand deals that solo creators could never achieve. Companies like Spotter or Jelly Smack, often backed by massive PE money, spend billions to buy the back catalogs of creators. They often create lump sum today for the rights of their past and future revenue. For a creator, it's a way to basically de-risk themselves, getting a $50 million check now rather than waiting 10 years for the money to pour in from YouTube might save them in the long term. And here's where it gets kind of interesting. When a PE firm takes over, it often changes the channel itself. There's a sanitization effect. To make a channel investor ready, often polish away their personality that once made their channel popular in the first place. They might push 5 videos a week instead of one high quality video. This is the world of optimizing for the algorithm and not the human connection. And basically, that's the complex, sometimes brilliant, and often brutal world of private equity. Whether it's improving companies like Hilton or killing companies like Toys R Us, in the world of PE, basically, you don't have an idea of what's going to happen unless you're behind the scenes. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Leave a 5-star rating if you like the show, or leave a review. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you for listening.